From LPM,
Louisville Public Media.
Support for LPM podcasts comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.
You're listening to Where Y'all Really From? I'm your host, Dan Wu, and today's guest is Teja Sudhakar, a UK graduate and currently residing in Lexington. Her biggest passion, her vocation even, is writing and poetry. She recently self-published a chapbook called Looking for Smoke, a collection of poems that she wrote about the experiences of first-generation migrant women living in Kentucky. Teja, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, Teja, where are you really from?
Oh, gosh. I've gotten that question a few times, which is so funny.
Just a few.
Most of the time I give people the answer they really want to hear, you know? Sometimes I try to screw around and be like, I'm from Lexington. And I feel like I am because this is the place is home to me. But where I'm really from is Chennai, in the state of Tamil Nadu in India. And I go back there every couple years or something. So it's nice to be able to remember that's where I'm really from, you know?
Do you feel like a visitor or a tourist when you go back as you sort of spend more time, the majority of your life here in the States?
Oh, for sure. Definitely. Technically I speak Tamil and Telugu, but the way I speak them, I sound like an American it's not the pronunciation, but it's the flow of my words or something. I just don't sound very natural speaking them.
The rhythm.
Yeah, and I feel kind of insecure when I go back about not being really Indian or something my parents tried to instill in me, understandably growing up, is they would be stop being so American, or when I did something, they would be this is so you're learning this from the white kids, but it's but I am though. I am American at the same time. So it's kind of wherever I am, it's I'm not enough of something else, Here, it's when I'm around white people, I'm oh, but I'm not enough of I'm too Asian for this. But then I go back there and I feel white. And it's really interesting because American exceptionalism and nationalism is so powerful in India. I remember I would play with my cousins and stuff when we were little kids, and they would take me to the playground and introduce me to their friends who are also little kids, and they would introduce me as oh, that's Teju, she's from the States. And suddenly I had all this power in this situation.
Oh, wow.
I was from the States. They would I was definitely shorter than every kid there, but they would just treat me with so much more respect. And I really internalized that. I was as a kid, I was oh, I'm so because I'm American. But it's no, I'm just lucky, or I'm just different, And so that's something I realized only in college, how deep the American elitism was so deep rooted in me, you know?
Poetry. Were you one of these kids that from an early age was not paying attention in class and just writing your own stuff?
I think I was always the classic teacher's pet, good student, I would say. I think poetry came to me in middle school mostly. It kind of came on accident. But that's how the best things happen, the most natural things.
Yeah. Was your sort of middle school poetry, was it all dark and angsty and gothy?
Even into the end of high school, it was very angsty. It was like, nobody understands me. I'm the only person going through this whole thing.
Classic stuff. I have a couple of teenagers myself, and, young folks have a tendency of thinking that they invented everything, including feelings.
Yeah.
So it's but to me, writing has always been such a great way to express that. For me, when I was in high school, it was art, drawing angsty art instead. How old were you when you came to the States?
I was 5.
Wow.
So it was April of 2006 that I came.
Tell me a little bit about that journey, where you all landed. Do you remember your sort of first impressions, and do you remember India?
I remember India was very, I would say, my warmest childhood memories are from India. I remember, I lived in my grandma's house mostly, even though my parents had their own house. And I was, mostly raised by my grandmother. And it was just, I had a lot of friends. And in India, kids were very, hands-on, touchy. Everyone was, very comfortable with each other. And I think, I moved when I was 5. I remember I, did not know English. So, also, I didn't know that white people existed. I was so confused. I was like, what's wrong with everybody here? Because I'd never seen a white person before.
Wow.
And where I came from was pretty, homogenous, racially. So I came, and that was I was like, who are these people? Why are they like that? But I moved to Omaha, Nebraska, which is a really hard place to move to when you're 5 years old and you don't know English and you're brown. I was probably the first brown kid. So it was interesting because I'd never seen a white person before. They'd probably never seen a brown person before. I remember my mom and I made fun of accents, American accents, especially the R's. We thought they were funny. I remember driving from the airport to our apartment for the first time, and we got in the car, and it was the steering wheel was on the left side. And I was like, it's on the left. And the road was on the wrong side. Yeah, that was my first impression. But everything was just kind of and kids in India were very touchy, and we would play rough. We would we were very comfortable with each other. But I remember in school, when I first started school in the United States, the big rule was hands and feet to yourself. And I felt very that was not how I learned to play. So I felt very, I don't know, isolated in that way.
Did you get in trouble much in school for that kind of stuff?
I got in trouble for random stuff that I didn't understand. Probably mostly because of the language barrier. I just kindergarten was a blur. I just remember never knowing what was going on ever. There were all these rules I didn't understand. And I got in trouble once because I saw another kid bring a stuffed animal to school. So then the next day I begged my mom, and I brought one of my toys to school, and I got in trouble for it, and I still don't know why. So, and it, just everyone else seemed to know what was going on, and I was just confused all the time.
What did your parents do for work when they came here?
So my dad is a software engineer, so we moved for his job. He was working in some healthcare company in Omaha. That's where his office was. And my mom was already a doctor in India. She was an ophthalmologist. But when we moved here, none of her education mattered. So when we moved, she was studying, I think, for the USMLE, and she was doing research at a university. And she was studying and trying to become a doctor here too. And she eventually did, but it took a really long time because the education system here just didn't value any of her experience.
Yeah. And that's why we have folks from other countries with masters and doctorates, driving cabs and washing clothes.
Yeah.
at some point, I guess about 10 years ago, you all moved to Lexington. What brought you to Lexington, and did you feel any sort of culture shock or difference coming from Omaha?
So in between Omaha and Lexington, I lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan for 2 years because both my parents were doing things at the University of Michigan. And then we came to Lexington for UK because my mom got her residency at UK in neurology. But I remember Ann Arbor was like such a welcome change from Nebraska because it was so diverse. Like there were like not only other Asian kids in my classes, but other like Indian kids, like multiple others, to the point where like we would like share lunch and stuff. When like in Nebraska, I was always like made fun of for like bringing Indian food. In Ann Arbor, I would bring Indian food on purpose because I knew that like my brown friends would appreciate it. So coming to Lexington after Ann Arbor was like a little bit tough because, you know, I got used to first like having no diversity, then a lot of diversity, and then going back to like a really white school was kind of tough. I think like I really believed in all the stereotypes about Kentucky. Like I remember telling my friends at the end of like 5th grade that I was moving to Kentucky, and they were like, "Oh, you're gonna like live on a farm, or like there's gonna be no buildings or whatever. You're not gonna wear shoes." And I was like so worried. So I was just like surprised that there were buildings and like,
Wow.
you know, yeah, I was like 9 or 10. Yeah.
Have you felt since then Lexington and kind of maybe Kentucky at large becoming more diverse? Not as diverse as we would want it to be, but certainly more so than when you first moved here.
I think like yes and no. Like growing up, like I guess getting older, I started noticing the diversity thing more because like when you're a kid, you kind of just accept the situation and you don't really like think too hard about it. So like when I was in Ann Arbor, I was like, oh, this is really nice. But I didn't know enough about the world to like think about why is this nice and why does this mean a lot to me? I just kind of accepted it. And yeah, when I came here, I was like, oh, this feels a little bit more lonely, but I can't pinpoint why or I can't notice why. And I went to MSTC in Dunbar for high school, so there were like other Asian kids around me, and that was really nice. But then going to UK after that was like really white, even in like UK honors. And I was surprised, you know, because I got used to having a little bit more diverse like high school experience.
As your parents moved places, were they able to sort of find and connect with Indian or South Asian communities? And where do you find it? Like, where do you start when you land in Lexington? If you want to find other Indian people, like, how do you do it?
I think for my mom, it was a lot through like her residency and stuff. But then we started going to temple events. And that's like a lot of where I feel like Indian communityhood happens is at the temple. Because I'm not like super religious, and my parents are like religious, but not like super duper religious. But we go to like the temple has a lot of cultural events. So that's where you kind of like meet people. And then Indian parties, they're so funny because they just like happen for no reason. It's so funny. Like my parents will find any excuse to have a potluck, but it's just like, you know, people in our neighborhood and people from the temple and people from the hospital. And it's just like, I think like as immigrants, like throwing potlucks and throwing parties is like a really important. I make fun of them. I'm like, why are you having a party? Right. But I also know why, you know?
Yeah.
It's like, it's the closest we feel like to home, you know?
Well, to me, holidays are always just an excuse to get together and eat.
Yes.
And then if you don't even need the excuse, you just get together and eat.
Yeah.
And whoever came up with the idea of the love languages, the 5 love languages, you can definitely tell there's cultural bias there because they're missing a huge love language.
Yeah.
And that's food.
Yeah.
And that's not just Asian folks, and that's not just immigrants even. There are so many people for whom, like, food is your love language.
Yeah.
Like, your parents could be real mad at you, but they'll still pack you a lunch to go to school or go to work.
That is definitely my relationship with my parents. Like, the immigrant dad trope of, like, I'm not going to talk to you about your feelings, but I will quietly bring a bowl of fruit to your room and just, like, set it on your desk and not say anything.
Yeah. As, you know, as somebody who's a writer, who's, you know, in some ways, like, your job or the essence of what you do is putting feelings on paper, putting thoughts on paper. And then growing up with parents, you know, I don't know what your parents were like exactly, but culturally speaking, a lot of Asian cultures, like, we don't talk about feelings.
Yeah.
We certainly don't talk about them positively. We don't say the I love yous. We don't tell you we're proud of you and what a good job you've done and, you know, what these sort of issues are. Did you feel like as you were growing older and going through school and especially being around, you know, American kids, white kids who did talk about feelings, whose parents did talk about feelings, did you start to feel that difference? And, you know, how did you relate to your parents in that context?
Yeah, I think, like, my family, we definitely fall into that stereotype of, like, Asian parents who don't talk about feelings. And it was, like, it's honestly still hard, like, having white friends who, like, talk about their parents in such a, like, you know, or, like, when I have a lot of white friends who are, like, best friends with their parents or, like, are able to talk to their parents about, like, someone they're seeing or, like, when they're stressed out, they're able to call their parents and be like, I'm stressed out. Can you actually make me less stressed? You know, I think, like,
as opposed to more.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, like, honestly, writing became a survival tool for me in that way because, like, I didn't have an outlet with my parents. And also, that's also why, like, chosen family and friendship became incredibly important to me because, like, in a lot of ways, like, my friends, and some of them older friends and some of them just, like, friends my age, like, they take care of me in a way that, like, a parent would. I think because they know that, like, yeah, they are, like, in some ways, like, my friends are my parents, you know? Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's always been interesting for me as a parent. I've always balked a little bit at the idea of, like, when people say, like, oh, my son or my daughter is my best friend. And I'm like, you need to get some more friends.
Yeah.
And from an Asian cultural standpoint, you will never hear that. A parent will never say this is, there's much more of a distinction of, like, this is my child, this is my responsibility, sometimes, like, subordinate, you know what I mean? Like, you're, there's a lot more delineation between generations.
Yeah.
I know for Chinese folks, you never call your aunts and uncles by their name.
Yeah,
Like,
no.
it's like first aunt, big aunt, little aunt, you know, second uncle, things like that. You don't call them by their names. You certainly don't call your grandparents by their names.
No.
There's
Yeah.
no way, right?
Yeah. And every, like, person your parents' age becomes auntie or uncle.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
That's something that's really sweet, actually. It feels like, I think that feels like a chosen family thing. Like, oh, like, you're my mom's friend from the hospital, but I'm going to call you auntie as if you're in my family. I think that's a very sweet thing.
It really is kind of, it exemplifies the idea of it takes a village.
Yeah.
We were talking a whole lot about parents. And my biggest curiosity sort of about your life and journey is that you went through college as a writing major and focused in on poetry, and now you're heading towards getting your MFA in poetry. If I were a stereotypical Asian parent, especially given that your parents came from technology and medicine, how the hell did they let you go down this path?
I'm flattered that you think I was a poetry major in college because it actually took a long time to get there, and I kind of chickened out the whole time until the very end. So I started college as a neuroscience pre-med major. My mom is like a neuro-ophthalmologist at UK, so she was very they were very pleased. And I remember like my graduation party in high school, like all the old Indian adults were like, oh, you're following your mom's footsteps. Like, and she was like very proud of me at that point. And then a year passed and I was like, oh no. Oh no.
I made a terrible mistake.
Well, I think like anatomy is fascinating. I think the human body is fascinating. And I was like, maybe I don't like hard science. Maybe I like learning about the mind in a soft science way. And also, like, psychology is a word that I can say to brown people, and they know what it is. And they will, like, just, you know, do a little squint. But they'll, like, they'll be like, oh, maybe she's still pre-med if she's a psych major. So I switched to a psychology and gender and women's studies double major and a creative writing minor. So the parts that I actually truly cared about were gender studies and creative writing. But I was like, we're going to throw in like...
You kind of had a beard a little bit.
Yeah. And I dropped the pre-med, which was incredibly hard for my mom. And I, like, throughout college, like, even into, like, late junior year, she was still, like, you know, with just a couple more classes,
You're almost there.
You can do pre-med. And I was like, why would I put myself through orgo when I know I don't want to be a doctor? You know, I did the whole, like, I shadowed doctors. I, like, took anatomy labs. Like, I did the whole 9. I tried to like it very much. And I really respect her profession and what they do. And, like, shadowing was cool. Like, I saw surgeries and stuff. That was insane. But also, like, I just, like, the lifestyle. And there were other things that I loved too much to ignore. And I think writing was something I tried to ignore. Like, it was something I tried to convince myself was a side project. Or, like, my parents would always be like, oh, like, you can do writing as a hobby, but you can be a doctor in your main, you know.
Right.
And I tried to find the middle ground by being like, maybe I'll do neuroscience, but I'll be a professor and not a doctor. I always had an interest in, like, teaching college. And then slowly that turned to, maybe I'll be a psych professor. Maybe I'll be an English professor, you know? So, and then last summer I was thinking about, like, grad school, and because I was like, if I do school, like, no matter what I study, it's school. And, you know, brown parents will be like, it's school. We'll pay for it because it's school. But I knew that I didn't want to do psychology for grad school. And I talked to people in grad school, and they were like, whatever you pick for grad school has to be the thing that you really, really care about, because it's grad school and it's hard, and you can't, like, half-ass grad school. And so I was like, okay, maybe English. But then I talked to an English professor about grad school, and within, like, 20 minutes, she was like, girl, you just want to be a writer. Like, just, like, stop beating around the bush. And I was like, no. So then she told me that an MFA is, like, a terminal degree that you can teach with, technically. So then that was what was like, okay, maybe I can get a job, maybe. And it's just, like, the thing I've always wanted to do, and I knew that I would just, like, be so mad at myself if I never even tried, you know? And, like, looking back on college, like, I'm a little mad at myself that I wasn't brave enough to major in English, you know? Like, if I switched the major, like, why not just go all the way? But I tried to break, like, one small rule after the next, after the next. And now I'm just breaking all the rules. And it was, like, it was really hard for them to accept. And it still is. Like, you know, they still have moments of, like, maybe it's just a phase she's going through. And then in the end, she'll realize, like, and I think, like, as immigrants, like, I completely understand their perspective, because it's like math and science is what got them here and built their whole life. And, like, what gave me the opportunity to, like, do what I actually care about, you know? And, like, my mom genuinely loves being a doctor, and she loves, like, caring for people. And she's a great doctor. So it's like, it's hard for her to see that her passion is not my life passion, But I've tried to tell her, like, it's not anything to do with you. It's just me. Like,
Do you feel like, and this is pure speculation, if your parents had come here as children, do you think they would do what they're doing now? Or do you think they would also see that they had other options? And does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it would definitely be different because, like, also the education system in India is, like, way different, at least, like, in the time that they were growing up. In India, it was, like, your test score determines your career.
Yep.
So, like, my dad was really good at math, and that's why he became an engineer. My mom was really good at science, and and, like, her mom also pushed her to be a doctor. But I think, like, if they had grown up here, they would have always grown up with more options, like knowing that people have options. But they're, like, in India, they're kind of pushed into their career, like, from a very young age, So there's not as much, like, freedom or choice with choosing. It might be different now, but at least when they grew up, like, that's what it was like.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more from Teja Sudhakar. You're listening to Where Y'all Really From? Welcome back to Where Y'all Really From? I'm Dan Wu, and my guest today is poet Teja Sudhakar. Well, tell me a little bit about your self-published chapbook, Looking for Smoke. It's got kind of an interesting genesis to it.
Yeah, so it was essentially my thesis project for the Gain Center for the Humanities and also for, like, the Lewis Honors College. It's so funny because when I parked here, I realized that, like, last summer in this, like, exact time, like, probably an exact year ago from now, I was parking in the church on North Broadway. I think it's called Embrace Church. Because that's where the immigration clinic is that I worked with for making this book. So I knew that I wanted to do poetry for my thesis, and I knew I wanted to do something with women, but it was always like I didn't know what to narrow it down to. And then I thought about, like, my own writing journey, and I was like, oh, like, the way that I dealt with, like, or processed being an immigrant was writing about it. It was like, I think that's, like, the thing that really turned me towards poetry is, like, that's the first time when I read those, like, I am from poems and stuff, it felt like the first time I had something real to say when I was a kid, I was like, oh, my I am from poem is, like, different than other people's. Like, I can make something out of this. And poetry is what made me realize that, like, being an immigrant is cool and it's, like, interesting and not something I, like, should be ashamed of or, like, embarrassed of. And I think, like, poetry has historically been a way for, like, marginalized people of all different backgrounds to, like, have a voice on the page, and have, like, humanity, and I started learning about this genre called documentary poetry, which is, like docu-poets, they pick, like, a specific, like, historically marginalized population or some, story or hardship that's, like, overlooked by news, and they give them, like, they shed light on that. And it's not about giving people humanity, it's about, like, making their humanity, like, the humanity that already exists, be seen, essentially, because the news about, like, things like immigration and stuff is incredibly dehumanizing. Yeah. It's like, turning this mass issue into, like, you see immigrants as, like, a mass group of people, and not as, like, individual stories. And so I realized, like, oh, I have to do this, like, immigration thing, and so it's like this chapbook is supposed to tell, like, a larger story about immigration, but more so like the small stories about these individual people and what that says about immigration and womanhood.
Well, I would love to hear one of these pieces. You brought your chapbook.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Okay. So earlier we were talking about how Asian parents like don't really talk about feelings, but they communicate through food and love. And especially like in Asian womanhood and like in growing up like as an Indian girl, like food is like important, like being a homemaker. And so this one is about my like relationship with my mom and sort of how food is part of that relationship a little bit. It's called The Interviewer Stands. On a Saturday, I leave midway through my paper on war poetry to drive home to my mother. I've become an expert on safety and how to go about finding it. On the way there, I listened to Tamil songs. I'd forgotten I knew the words. Nothing is safe about my mother. We are a war on its brink, our arrows aimed. But she's made the kitchen smell now like payasam, sweet milk and cashew. For a moment, our blades are sheathed as I clove tomatoes, turn chopped onions in their turmeric, cumin, chili powder glaze. Nobody warns you that war smells like coconut milk, cardamom, that war-making is in the backs of your mother's arms, circling around your own. The next morning, at Quaker meeting, I remember war and safety can be indistinguishable, how God can look like a room full of silence. My mother is the safest colonel I know. She is both the shelter and the bomb striking it, the tanks and their wide black shadows. I've never spoken in church before, but today the clouds pull through a barred window, and the rain builds inside of them like 1,000 wet feet. My throat isn't ready for the words it's holding. After a war, nobody teaches you how to grieve. Nobody tells you that the lining of your heart must be shed. Today, I feel mine leave through my open mouth. My feet bite into the holy ground. It is the last day of war. The teeth are digging. The teeth are digging.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It makes me think of the idea of crying from sadness and then crying from onions at the same time.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody's done this yet, but I would love to see a poetry book where every poem's also a recipe.
Oh my gosh.
Because the first half of your piece kind of made me think of that, because there were a lot of sort of descriptive narrative about, cutting vegetables and things like that. So.
Wow, that would be incredible.
Yeah.
Have you heard of Savannah Sipple?
Mm-hmm.
She's amazing. Have you read one of her poems called Pass Back? It's incredible. It's about like body image and food and cooking, and it's kind of like there's like, these paragraphs of like prose of like her, thinking, but then there's also like interspersed with it is like a recipe for like, I can't remember, it might be like baked beans or something, but it's like kind of the recipe is broken up into pieces, and in between is like passages of, it's really cool. It's like one of the poems that inspires me a lot. But a whole book of that would be insane, like really cool.
Yeah. One of the things that really interests me is the idea of Asian American or Asian American Pacific Islander or whatever acronym you want to use has never been a comfortable fit since day one, because it's so expansive and it includes so many people of very disparate backgrounds, very disparate experiences. The idea that a lot of Pacific Islanders have more of a colonization story than an immigration story of Asian Americans. And then you have folks, you have East Asia, you have South Asia, you have Southeast Asia, Pacific Islands. For you, how do you identify in those terms, and when did you come upon it?
Yeah, it's always been kind of like difficult because I call myself Asian, and then I feel wrong for calling myself Asian even though I am. But like there's such a separation in the community, and a large part of it is because that label is so like, what's the word for when you push a bunch of people together? Like that, you know, because like a lot of white people get to have their own, like, I'm Irish, I'm British, you know, but we're just like, I'm Asian, and it's like half the world, you know, it's like a huge continent. And like, you know, I look different from like East Asian people, and I look different from like Pacific Islanders. So it's like, I never know where I fit. And so I say Asian, I say South Asian, but most of the time I say Indian. And yeah, some things, like I have East Asian friends, and we relate on a lot of things, but some things obviously are specific to our own like cultures. But we've been like pushed together in this category. So now we like relate on a lot of things too. And I feel like, yeah, there shouldn't be so much division within, you know, our community, but also the community label is like trying to encapsulate so many people into one, like as the same thing, you know? So it's a hard it's a hard task.
I would love to see us sort of as a community take it back to its roots from the 1960s in the civil rights movement, when Asian American activists were allied with the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement, because literally before then we were called Orientals.
Yeah.
And I don't even know that Orientals included South Asians. I don't know if there was a whole nother nomenclature for that. And at some point, some students, I think, on the West Coast, college students, they said, like, no, we're Asian Americans. And so the term in its origins is imbued with political activism. It's tied with what I think of as like a conscious like framing, like maybe even an understanding that we're all different, but we're trying to fall under this umbrella to build power.
Yeah. I really like that much better, actually. I didn't realize that that's where like the label originally came from, but I think like now the way that I commonly see it, which is unfortunate, is like when acts of violence happen and it's like, oh, Asian American, like stop Asian hate and stuff like that, you know. But I would like to think about it more as an empowering term, like from its roots, you know.
Well, Teja Sudhakar, are you ready for our lightning round?
I think.
Okay.
Let's go for it.
Here we go. What is your superpower?
I think creating a safe space is my superpower. Like, I think this is like, it could be very literal in that I'm very proud of my room because it's like a very cozy place to be, and I've like made all the colors very warm and welcoming and go together, but it's also like more in friendship. Like, I think I'm a good listener, and so I think people feel comfortable like telling me things, and I also introduce people to each other a lot, and I try my best to make them feel safe and comfortable. So I think I'm good at like creating safety in a situation.
What's your favorite song to jam out to?
That is so hard because I'm like a music. I am always listening to music.
If you were coming out into an arena, what would be your intro song? What would be your hype song? Like when the fireworks go off and you come out from the curtain, what's the song?
Do you know the song "Come Around" by MIA? It's so good, and it's a banger. So when I first listened to it, I was like, this is a banger. But then when I kept listening to it, I realized it sampled a song from my like like a Tamil song from my childhood. And I was like, this is like so me, you know, this is my banger.
What's your favorite comfort food?
Probably sambar. So it's like, it's like traditional South Indian lunch is like rice with sambar. And I don't know how to describe, it's kind of like this gravy vegetable, like you put it over the rice. You eat it with rice, and then you usually eat it with like beans poriyal. So poriyal is like a vegetable, kind of like a fried vegetable dish. So it's like, or like a stir fry. So a bean stir fry with like coconut flakes in it. It's so good. And like potato fry with it. So good.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. And lastly, what is the most Kentucky thing about you?
Oh gosh. I think like smiling at people on the street and waving when I'm driving. Just like the Southern hospitality thing. But I think it's interesting because like, I don't know, hospitality is a really big thing in Indian culture, but it just manifests in different ways. But like, I think the Southern hospitality is like definitely in me. Yeah.
Well, you're a Southern American and a South Indian.
Yeah.
So double Southern.
Wow.
Well, Teja, it's been so great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Where Y'all Really From is created and produced by Dan Wu, Charlene Buckles, May Suramek, and me, Nima Kulkarni. Our executive producer is Laura Ellis. Our associate producer is Alex Biscardi. Kojin Tashiro wrote our theme song, and Leanne Gann created our logo. Where Y'all Really From is part of the Louisville Public Media Podcast Incubator, with support from the Eye Care Institute's Butchertown Clinical Trials. Our Lexington interviews are recorded at Radio Lex with engineering and assistance by Mark Royce. For more information and to keep in touch, visit whereyallreallyfrom.org.
Every immigrant family has to decide what their relationship will be with their first language. Some parents insist their kids speak it. Some turn away from it entirely, and some land somewhere in between. We're talking about it later this season, and we want to hear from you. Do you speak your family's first language? How does language shape the way your family connects? Visit whereyallreallyfrom.org and click Talk Back, and we might use your message on the episode. That's whereyallreallyfrom.org and Talk Back.
Support for LPM podcasts comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.